Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, December 6th, 2021, and today I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson being torn down. And I know a lot of people are really upset about a statue, but most people who are outraged about this tearing down today have actually participated in a tearing down of Jefferson for ages, for decades and decades and decades, by ignoring or flat out rejecting the core principles that he supported. And I think the lesson that we all need to learn is that if you ignore these core principles, you are basically handing control of the narrative to your opposition, and you shouldn't be surprised when you don't like the end results of that. So on this episode, I've got highlights of 5 essential Jeffersonian principles that have been ignored for ages. But in his own words, starting with a foundation in his first inaugural address. And then I've got 2 more bonus ones, maybe 1, maybe 2. 2 of my favorites that I think are absolutely timeless as well. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. There you're going to find everything you need to follow the show. You're going to find all the archives. On individual episodes, I link to all the stuff that I'm referencing so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. I've got another episode. I've got all kinds of good stuff for you to read and check out later on. I publish that individual blog post for each individual episode about an hour to 2 hours after the live broadcast is done. You can also find all the platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch and DLive, and now we're also live streaming on LinkedIn, I think. We're also live stream on the decentralized, censorship-resistant Odyssey.com. We archive the videos at sovereign.media, Gab TV, Minds, and BitChute, and BitTube, and Brighteon, and all over the place, Rumble, and everywhere that we can possibly upload them. And we also have the audio-only podcast edition at the usual suspects, Apple, Podbean, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and the rest. And you can even find our membership program, where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And because I have some exciting maintenance happening here at the apartment building today, I'm not going to have the time to go through the live chat, but I will, like I normally do at the beginning of the show, but I will actually check it out a little bit later today, read through the comments, whether it's live or in the archive. First of all, leaving comments helps out a ton in triggering the algorithms and tells the algorithm to show the program to more people. But it also gives me a lot of ideas. I get questions, I get feedback, I get challenged. Sometimes I get stuff that's totally random. And as I wade through all the comments, I read through just about all of them, or as many as I can. I do get tons of ideas for future episodes. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts week in and week out. But let's get right to it. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is the show homepage. And I want to start out these 5 essential principles. Number 1 is the sum of good government. And this is where we're starting in his inaugural address, his first one, March 4th, 1801. And here's how he put it: a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. It's almost a taxation is theft message. He says this is the sum of good government. Basically, government almost completely stays the hell out of the way. He's had almost the same type of a message the following year. Of course, he's in office. He's writing to Thomas Cooper, November 29th, 1802. He said, if we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them, they must become happy. It was one of the leading maxims and principles of the American Revolution, that happiness came with freedom. A free people is going to be a happy people. And if you're not free, you're not going to be happy. And the foundation for that, you can't be free if someone can take your property without your consent. And this is really Jefferson putting those principles into practice in his administration many years later. So in other words, get out of the way and don't try to control what people do, period. The sum of good government is number one. But back to his first inaugural, after he had that message, and that was maybe a few paragraphs in, he then points out this: we're about to enter, fellow citizens, on the exercise of duties which comprehend everything dear and valuable to you. It is proper then that you should understand what I deem the essential principles of our government, and consequently those which ought to shape its administration. So here he just rattles through a list of 12 or 13 or 14, depending on how you count them, core principles, essential principles of his administration. And I'm going to highlight 4 of those and some related commentary from him over the years to be the other 4 essential Jeffersonian principles that I want to highlight today. And the number 2 is peace. And here's how Thomas Jefferson put it: peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Peace. Peace was so important to Jefferson. He literally mentioned it. You can Command F it, or control whatever type of operating system you're using. But you read through that first inaugural address where he had this quote. He said peace 7 times. You can't have liberty in the midst of continual warfare. Jefferson understood this, and Jefferson wanted to have policies that advanced peace. And this was a recurring theme for him throughout his career. Here he is in a letter to John Adams, April 25th, 1794. He said, I confess to you, I have seen enough of one war, never to wish to see another. And why? A very similar message just the following week to Tench Cox, May 1st, 1794. He put it this way: as to myself, I love peace, and I am anxious that we should give the world still another useful lesson by showing to them other modes of punishing injuries than by war, which is as much a punishment to the punisher as to the sufferer. And I know a lot of people, even though I could go over time and time again, repeat all these messages from Jefferson regarding peace and opposing unilateral executive war-making powers under the Constitution, you'll still get people, no matter what, claiming things like, well, no matter what the situation is today, when the executive branch does something that they're not authorized to under the Constitution in regards to war, they'll say, well, Jefferson did the same thing against those pirates, so therefore we can, even Jefferson did this. But in almost every scenario that comes up in, almost every single time, and I would say every time, but I don't want to be an absolutist, you can tell that as soon as they say that, they know absolutely nothing about the history of the First Barbary War, which I covered. I've got the episode here up on the screen in early 2020. Thomas Jefferson versus the Barbary Pirates. I think it's somewhere around 45 or 50 minutes. It's one of my longer episodes, but it's very detailed and it's still scratching the surface. But I encourage you to check that out. It'll give you a lot of firepower to refute the absurd claim that Jefferson's actions supported the modern version of unilateral executive war declaring and war making power of today. I will link to that in the show notes. Number 1 is peace. Jefferson was a huge advocate of peace. Number 2 is peace. Number 1, the sum of good government, get out of the way. 2 is peace. 3 is really the 10th Amendment. And here's how he put it: the support of the state governments in all their rights. This is again in his first inaugural. Now, just a quick aside. I know a lot of people say, but states don't have rights, governments don't have rights. Now, we can think in the founding generation at the time, the word rights meaning what we think of as rights, natural rights, liberties, etc. But they also used rights interchangeably with powers when it came to using it in this type of a phrase: the support of the state governments in all their power, their authorized powers. He says, as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns and the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies. Anti-republican meaning a spirit of consolidation, centralization of power. So the states would be, you want to decentralize, have a federal structure. You don't want one-size-fits-all solutions, because the way to deal with domestic issues is to decentralize. And then on top of it, when the federal or the general government tries to do anti-republican things, expand its power, consolidate power, centralize it, they would be the line in the sand to stop that stuff. And this is a very consistent message from Jefferson throughout the years. Here, for example, from his opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank 10 years earlier, February 15th, 1791, he put it this way: I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground. And you'll recognize this phrase, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. And yes, he skipped over the word respectively. That was included in the final ratified version of the 10th Amendment that was ratified 10 months later, December 15, 1791. But still, Jefferson, the 10th Amendment was the foundation of the Constitution. But you can't just wave a document at government and hope that government is going to stop doing stuff that government does, which is expand its power. You have to do something about it, but we'll get to that in just a moment. He said, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. So he saw the foundation of the Constitution being the legal rule of construction, that is the 10th Amendment along with the 9th, that the federal government is only authorized to do the stuff that's been delegated to it. Anything beyond that is basically setting the stage for them to have a boundless field of power. So you have to be able to stop it. And as we know, he saw the states, the people of the several states then, that is, as the surest, the best bulwarks, the best line in the sand, the best firewall against centralization of power, against usurpations of power. And here he is in his draft, his fair copy draft for the Kentucky resolutions of 1798. He wrote these sometime before October 4th of that year. He said the several states are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. So the people of the several states don't just have to, they're not united on the idea that whatever the central or general government says, they're just going to fall into line. No, they're going to do something about it. And he went further. He said, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So core principle number 3 that has been rejected or ignored for ages is the 10th Amendment. The people of the several states as the foundation of the Constitution. Number 4 is spending, insane spending, being frugal in spending and having no crazy amounts of debt. This is how he put it. Economy in the public expense, that labor may be lightly burthened, the honest payment of our debts, and sacred preservation of the public faith. This is one of the list of principles that he was going to implement for his administration. This was back again in 1801. And here's how he put it in a letter to Alexander Donald some years earlier, July 28, 1787. The maxim of buying nothing without the money in our pocket to pay for it would make our country one of the happiest upon earth. Don't have a government loaded up with all kinds of debt. If you have the money for it and you think it's a good thing to do, then maybe you can spend it, but don't just load up on insane levels of debt. And here he is with a similar message to John Taylor of Caroline, May 28, 1816. He said, the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. The short version is, if they're spending stuff today that can't be paid for today, but in the hopes or the claim that it's going to be paid for by some future generation, is really ripping them off. It's really evil. You're taking from people the labor, what they've earned, and they haven't even been born yet. This is just criminal to do this. Swindling futurity on a large scale, said Jefferson in 1816. And here he is again in 1816 in July to Samuel Kercheval. We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. And number 5 is trial by jury. This is not something that's, you can see if you're watching on the screen, you can see where I did the Command F for peace. Let's do it again. You look up peace, and it shows up 7 different times, over and over and over. Anyways, here's a whole list of things. Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of person under the protection of the habeas corpus, and trial by juries impartially selected. And here's Jefferson again in a letter to Thomas Paine, July 11th, 1789. He said, I consider trial by jury as the only anchor ever yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution. If you think about it, if trial by jury is the anchor to hold people to the principles of the Constitution, to hold a government, that means, first, the whole combination is people have to be define the government laws in order to have a trial in the first place, and then the people of their community, the trial by jury, then have to determine that that law is unjust, and then they vote to acquit. Jury nullification, very straightforward stuff. That was his letter to Thomas Paine, July 11th, 1789. I covered trial by jury, defense against tyranny a couple of years ago, over 2 years ago. It's one of my favorite episodes from the old school days, I guess, at this point. I will link to that in the show notes as well. Again, trial by jury, defense against tyranny. Those are 5 key principles, Jeffersonian principles from his first inaugural address that I think have been ignored across the spectrum. Of course, we know on the left, but many people on the right who claim to be outraged by tearing down Jefferson today, they've ignored these things over and over as well, especially if we're thinking the sum of good government, leave people alone no matter what, whether you like what they're doing or not. 2, the peace, 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 peace. 3rd is the 10th Amendment as the foundation. Cut down on the spending, don't have huge amounts of debt, and of course, trial by jury and jury nullification. And these are 2 bonus ones that really, I think, they just hit home for me. One of my own kind of pet peeves is when, and you primarily hear this on the right, this kind of boasting about being a law-abiding citizen. We want law-abiding citizens to have the right to keep and bear arms. We want law-abiding citizens to be able to do this or that. And the idea of just abiding by law after law after law, when you live in a government, under a government that is the largest government in the history of the world with tens of thousands of laws and rules and regulations and mandates, being law-abiding isn't something to brag about at all. And in fact, here's Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Isaac Tiffany in April of 1819, making a much more eloquent case than I can. He says, rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within the limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. In other words, just pure liberty is just to do whatever you want. He says, is unobstructed action according to our will in the plenitude of its extent. But rightful liberty is to do what is according to our own will without violating the rights of others. He says, I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the right of an individual. Again, he specifically didn't say that liberty is doing what is our own will within the limits of the law, because that's not the principle that we're focusing on. We're focusing on the idea of making our own free choice, but not violating the rights of others while we're making that free choice. Because a lot of times the law, and so many times, a lot of times, a vast majority of the times, what is law on books, what is law from politicians, from government, is just what Jefferson said, the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the right of an individual. And the last one I want to close out today is this one. In a letter to Francis Hopkinson, March 13th, 1789, he said, if I could not go to heaven, but with a party, I would not go there at all. That's where he was answering Francis's question about whether he was a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist, and he said, absolutely not on either. I may be further away from one or the other. I will link to it in the show notes so you can read the whole letter. But if I could not go to heaven, but with a party, I would not go there at all. Absolutely nothing helps us get this kind of information out to more and more people every single day, then the financial faith and support of our members. It helps us roll up our sleeves and do this kind of work. So I want to give a quick shout out and a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us here at the TAC as members recently. Thank you so much for supporting us. There's Jacqueline in Texas, Marilyn in Utah, Mandy in California, Peter in North Carolina, and Frank in Illinois. The membership program is 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I do hope you enjoyed this show. I hope you learned something. I hope it was educational. I hope it was interesting, all that stuff. Of course, if whether or not you're able to support us through the membership program, please also consider smashing the like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Again, comments in the archive, sharing links, all that stuff really helps more than you can imagine. We're reaching more and more people than I ever even thought was possible in doing this show. And I know, again, we're still scratching the surface. Again, I really appreciate being here. I'll get this, the blog posted for the episode along with all the show links and all the references in the next hour or so. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.